As Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, it's an attempt to create the impression that your past is a wasteland of non-achievement, that you have no reference to any greatness, to any science. Even as we stood amidst the pyramid, as we stood at the great Zimbabwe monument, as we stood at the remnants of the Benin Kingdom, the first city in the world to have lights, as we stood in the midst of greatness built by our ancestors, knowing that Mansa Musa was the wealthiest man in the world at some stage, they still wanted to persuade you that you have no value, intellectual, physical, or spiritual, that your beliefs are mere fetishes.
I'm a king.
Before I begin, allow me to acknowledge the historical struggle of the Maroons in Jamaica, the Haitian revolutionaries, our ancestors who perished in their millions in the ocean and in the middle corridors. Let me acknowledge the women of Africa who bravely resisted enslavement, colonization, and apartheid. Allow me to acknowledge the nameless comrades, because Sankara we know, Machel we know, Mandela we know, Sekou Touré we know, but the gallant fight against immiseration, emasculation, dehumanization was carried out by nameless, faceless women for whom this struggle is a redemption song. Wherever they rest, let them hear that their great-grandchildren have arisen to fight on. I want to talk today about chattel enslavement of Africans, colonization and apartheid. And I want to establish continuities that help us understand why this struggle is both about memory and about imagination. This is a recognition of the fact that the transatlantic chattel enslavement of Africans was a crime against humanity, that apartheid was a crime against humanity, and this is recorded in UN resolutions, that colonialism was characterized by a series of genocide. In case you think this is hyperbole, you will know of the genocide against the Herero and the Nama in Namibia. You will know about the genocide against the Khoi and the San. You will know about the genocide in the Congo. Of course, when you raise the question of reparations, there are people within the African community and amongst Afro-descendants and within other racial groupings who say children do not carry the sins of their fathers. As unfortunate and as painful as enslavement was, and colonialism and apartheid were, they happened too long ago to be possible of any rational discourse. These geniuses also tell us that in any event, how would we determine who deserves or is entitled to redress, including citing cases of mixed-race children born to both enslaved and slave-owning parents, and claims that the West was not the only slave-owning civilization, that the West is actually the only civilization that morally abolished slavery. These geniuses also tell us enslavement had nothing to do with race, but economics. Arabs had slaves, Africans had slaves, they say. And in any event, this word slave comes from the word Slavs. And the Slavs were enslaved by Arabs. That blacks and Africans were not only the only enslaved race. So why are you making so much noise? And some have even told us that the censoring reparations denies the agency of Africans, as envisaged by Marcus Garvey, who said we shall redeem ourselves, that the act of self-economic development somehow negates the demand for historical justice. That what Africa and Afro-descendants need is investment and technology transfer, not white charity or payments from the white world. They also tell us that the reparations talk ignores the harm that has been occasioned to Africans by black African leaders. That in any event, that enslavement was legal. So my friends, why would people within enslaved community or descendants of enslaved and colonized people believe in these things? I want you to understand these 8 cardinal rules that manufacture not slaves, but that might manufacture psychotic and neurotic conditions. That Wilson said of them in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. He said, the Negro will always use the back door. I'm paraphrasing. Why? Because he's been taught that is his place, and he accepts that that is his place. If there is no door, he will cut the door so that he can use the place assigned to him. Number 1, dehumanization through law. The Barbados Slave Code. It said blacks are not fully human, but beasts of burden, savages. As such, their existence is not governed by law, human rights, human dignity, or humanity. So, you can treat them as property, own them, dispose of them. Number 2, natives have no sense of commerce, of ownership, of value, which led to the justification of alienation of our intellectual property, our inventions, our scientific contributions, our land, our tangible and intangible assets. Justification for using poll and hard tax during colonialism in order to force our ancestors who were fairly food self-sufficient and wealthy to work for the plantations and the mines. The spiritualization of white supremacy and enslavement. That blacks are descendants of Ham, who was cursed to be hewers of wood and carriers of water, and therefore they are a people with no real benefit to society. They have no right to comfort, heritage, or legacy. Erasure of history, of images and symbols of past greatness through plunder, falsification, and alienation. That is the erasure of your cultural meaning and identity. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, it's an attempt to create the impression that your past is a wasteland of non-achievement, that you have no reference to any greatness, to any science. Even as we stood amidst the pyramid, as we stood at the great Zimbabwe monument, as we stood at the remnants of the Benin Kingdom, the first city in the world to have lights, as we stood in the midst of greatness built by our ancestors, knowing that Mansa Musa was the wealthiest man in the world at some stage, they still wanted to persuade you that you have no value, intellectual, physical, or spiritual, that your beliefs are mere fetishes. But this conversation is not about victimhood. This conversation is about our agency, that we are not what they said about us. This conversation is about redemption based on 3 anchors. Number 1, memory. That the one thing you do is you assume a cow or a horse that you used to plow has no memory of the whip you placed on its back and of the cruelty you did to it yesterday. We're not horses, we're not cattle. We're human beings. And we have a right to memory because memory is a terrain of struggle. Jewish people were deemed entitled to memory for the Holocaust, and today nobody ever tells them it happened too long ago. Today, on a particular day called the Day of Remembrance, the British wear a red poppy in remembrance of their heroes who fell when? A long time ago. About the time when the genocide against the Herero and the Nama was happening, about the time when they were hanging Nehanda, Nyikasikan, around the time when they were carrying out the atrocities against the Mau Mau. It may be a long time for others, but we live in a generation which, because of alienation and dispossession, is entitled to say, we owe ourselves the duty to heal from our own wounds. We owe ourselves the duty to hold our own dictators to account, but we will not allow you to try and construct political amnesia and erasure of your own contribution to the dysfunctions in the society we live in. When the British, the Dutch, the Spanish committed genocide and crimes here on the continent, they had not been established Spanish states, Dutch states, German states. It was before, for some of them, 1884 Berlin, or even after Berlin, they had not achieved de facto control of the territory. That's why there was resistance. You cannot insist that we apply the law of the offender. So we have to ask ourselves, what were the indigenous law requirements for the sort of atrocities? Lawyers, please, wake up. Do not accept this racialized anchorage of our law, where you say, okay, the law of the native is not general law, the law of the native is localized law, it's not international law. What you were doing was not international law, and I will come to it to demonstrate how the acts done against colonized people, the acts done against those under apartheid and enslaved people were acts done in violation of what was law at the time.
I'm a king, yes, I'm a king, I'm a king.